Unlocking the secret door, the researcher's terrifying discovery. The sound was faint at first, a dull, rhythmic thudding, but as Dr. Michael Greaves pressed his ear to the ancient door, it grew louder, almost human. Then a whisper. It wasn't his name, but it was speaking to him. His flashlight flickered, and as the door creaked open, a rancid smell of decay hit him like a fist. Something moved inside, wet, slithering, and impossibly fast. If you're ready to step into the unknown, subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell. Let's dive into a story that will keep you awake tonight. Dr. Michael Greaves had always been drawn to the kind of mysteries that sent others running. As an archaeologist and historian, his life was defined by the dusty pages of forgotten books, lost ruins, and artifacts that hinted at stories long buried by time. But even for him, the journal he found in the crumbling black hollow library was unsettling in a way that felt almost personal. It was old, far older than anything else in the decrepit building, and bound in leather that seemed too supple to have withstood the centuries. Its pages were filled with trembling handwriting, warning of a door hidden beneath the ruins of a forgotten cathedral in Virginia. The monks who had sealed it spoke of a corruption beyond salvation. The writer claimed that the door was not simply a relic of the past, but a prison for something that should never be disturbed. Michael had seen warnings like this before, elaborate superstitious tales meant to keep treasure hunters away. Most of the time they were more amusing than alarming, but something about the journal's frantic tone stayed with him. He found himself flipping back to it at odd hours, reading and rereading the cryptic descriptions of the door. The carvings etched into its surface were said to move when touched, and its metal was described as unnaturally warm, almost alive. He dismissed it as exaggeration, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the author believed every word. Against his better judgment, he decided to investigate. The ruins of the cathedral were in a remote part of Virginia, surrounded by dense, oppressive forest. The area was notorious for its eerie reputation. Locals whispered about strange lights and sounds emanating from the woods at night, and hikers often spoke of the overwhelming sense of being watched. Michael brushed off their stories as small-town paranoia, but as he approached the site, an inexplicable unease settled over him. The trees seemed to lean closer the farther he walked, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach churn. The cathedral itself was little more than a husk, its once grand walls reduced to crumbling stone and moss-covered debris. But deep beneath the ruins, hidden behind a collapsed archway, Michael found the door. It was just as the journal had described, massive, ancient, and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer under the weak light of his lantern. At first, he thought the designs were geometric patterns, but as he stepped closer, they began to resemble something else. Faces. Twisted, anguished faces, their mouths frozen mid-scream. He reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as he brushed against the metal surface. It was warm, almost hot, as though a fire raged on the other side. And then he felt it. A vibration, faint but undeniable, pulsing under his fingertips like a heartbeat. He pulled his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. The sensation was so vivid that he found himself staring at his palm, half expecting to see burns. The first whisper came as a barely audible hiss, like the sound of wind slipping through cracks in stone. Michael froze, straining to listen. The forest above was silent, unnaturally so, and the noise seemed to come from the door itself. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the surface. At first it was just a low murmur, indistinct and fragmented, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, the sounds began to coalesce. Words. They weren't in English, or any language Michael recognized, but their cadence felt disturbingly familiar. The whispers weren't random. They were speaking to him. He stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly and casting grotesque shadows across the damp walls. His rational mind tried to dismiss it as the wind, the creaking of old stone, anything other than what it seemed. But deep down, he knew better. Michael's hands shook as he lit another lantern, the weak flame doing little to dispel the suffocating darkness. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He'd come too far to turn back now. The journal's author had spoken of a key hidden nearby that would unlock the door. He began searching the debris, every shadowed corner and jagged crack in the stone, his movements frantic. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent, as though guiding him or warning him. After what felt like hours, he found it, a rusted iron key hidden beneath a pile of rubble. It was heavier than he expected, and the moment his fingers closed around it, a sharp jolt shot through his arm, like static electricity. He gasped, nearly dropping it, but the whispers surged in response, their tone shifting to something almost eager. As he inserted the key into the lock, the carvings on the door seemed to ripple, the anguished faces twisting and writhing as if in protest. The metal was burning hot now, searing his palm as he turned the key. The lock clicked, echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Then the door began to open, inch by agonizing inch, the sound of grinding stone reverberating through the narrow corridor. The air that spilled out was unlike anything Michael had ever encountered, thick, oppressive, and rancid with the stench of decay. It clung to his skin, suffocating him, as though he'd stepped into the lungs of some diseased creature. His lantern flickered violently, and in the dim, stuttering light, he thought he saw movement beyond the threshold. Something stirred in the darkness. It wasn't human, he was sure of that. The way it moved was too fluid, too alien, like smoke given form. Michael's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. He watched, paralyzed, as the shadows coalesced into something almost tangible, something wet and glistening, with too many limbs, and a face that wasn't a face at all, just a void of blackness that seemed to consume the light around it. And then, it spoke. Not in words, but in emotions. Waves of dread, despair, and an all-consuming hunger that crashed over him like a tidal wave. It wasn't asking for help. It was beckoning him, pulling him forward, deeper into the darkness. Michael stumbled back, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own ragged breaths. But even as he retreated, he knew he'd already gone too far. The door wasn't just a portal, it was a threshold. And now that it was open, there was no turning back. As the door creaked open, the first thing Michael noticed was the air. It didn't simply flow out. It seemed to spill, a suffocating wave of heat and rot that clung to his skin and crawled into his lungs. He gagged violently, staggering back as the fetid smell enveloped him. It was more than just the scent of decay. It was a concoction of death, damp earth, and something metallic, like old blood left to stagnate in the sun. He pressed a hand to his mouth, but the stench was so pervasive it felt as though it was burrowing inside him, saturating his every breath. For a brief moment, he thought he might pass out, the edges of his vision swimming with black spots, but a surge of adrenaline forced him upright. The door opened wider, grinding against the stone floor, and the sound echoed endlessly through the narrow corridor. It was a hollow, grating noise, almost alive in its intensity. The light from his lantern flickered and waned, the shadows on the walls twisting unnaturally, as though recoiling from what lay beyond. Michael squinted into the darkness, his pulse hammering in his ears. The beam of light from his flashlight trembled as his hand shook, illuminating the narrow passage ahead. The walls were slick, covered in streaks of moisture that glistened under the weak light. At first he thought they were water stains, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were something else entirely. Dark, viscous streaks that reeked of iron. The corridor stretched before him, its walls narrowing like the throat of some vast, predatory creature. The floor was uneven, slick with grime, and the air seemed to grow denser with every step he took. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the faint sound of his boots scraping against the stone and the steady, maddening drip of liquid somewhere ahead. He couldn't tell if it was water or something worse. Michael's flashlight caught something on the wall, a series of deep gouges carved into the stone. They were long and jagged, as though made by claws too large and sharp to belong to any animal he could name. He ran his fingers over them, the stone cool and damp beneath his touch. The grooves were deep, far too deep for any tool he'd seen before, and they trailed along the length of the corridor, disappearing into the darkness ahead. A chill ran down his spine as he imagined what kind of force could have created them. Whatever it was, it hadn't been trying to get in. It had been trying to get out. The whispers returned, faint at first, like the static hum of an old radio tuned to a dead station. They ebbed and flowed, growing louder as he moved deeper into the corridor. This time, they were different. The fragmented syllables and guttural murmurs seemed to overlap, their tone shifting between pleading and mocking, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. Michael clenched his teeth, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the whispers seemed to wrap around him, slithering into his ears and digging into his mind. The passage widened abruptly, opening into a chamber that was both vast and claustrophobic. The ceiling arched high above him, shrouded in shadows, while the walls seemed to close in, slick with the same dark substance that streaked the corridor. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a black box, ornate and alien in its design. Michael hesitated, the beam of his flashlight dancing across its surface. The box was small, no larger than a jewelry case, but its presence was overwhelming. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the intricate patterns etched into its surface, shifting subtly when he tried to focus on them. His footsteps echoed loudly as he approached, each step amplifying the oppressive silence around him. The whispers were louder now, almost intelligible, and they seemed to emanate from the box itself. Michael stopped a few feet away, his skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. He scanned the room, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the pedestal, the box, and the endless shadows. He reached out, his hand trembling, and the whispers surged, rising into a cacophony of voices that made him stagger. They were no longer fragmented, they were words, sharp, guttural, and spoken in a language he couldn't comprehend. His fingers hovered over the box, the air around it vibrating with an almost magnetic energy. It wasn't just the whispers that filled his mind now. It was emotions, waves of dread, despair, and a suffocating sense of inevitability. He wanted to pull back, to turn and run, but his body refused to obey. The first touch was electric, a jolt of freezing pain that shot through his hand and up his arm. He recoiled, gasping, but the box seemed to pulse in response, its surface shimmering like oil on water. Michael stared at his hand, expecting to see burns, but his skin was unmarked. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that made his ears ring. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and reached out again. As his fingers closed around the box, the chamber seemed to shudder. The walls groaned, and a low, guttural rumble echoed through the air, like the growl of some unseen predator. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting. Michael's heart pounded as he lifted the box, its weight far heavier than it should have been. The intricate patterns on its surface writhed and twisted under his touch, and the air grew colder with each passing second. A sudden, deafening scream erupted from the shadows, so raw and visceral that it felt like a physical blow. Michael spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the chamber, but there was nothing. Just the walls and the darkness closing in on him. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a mixture of human agony and animalistic rage, echoing endlessly in the confined space. Then, the whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time, they weren't just in his ears. They were inside his head, crawling through his thoughts like 1,000 writhing insects. Michael dropped the box in panic, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air, suspended by some unseen force, its surface glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The voices grew louder, overlapping, chaotic and unbearable. Michael stumbled back, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts. He wanted to leave, to escape, but the chamber seemed to stretch infinitely, the exit now an unreachable void. And as the darkness pressed in, he realized with a sinking dread that he wasn't alone. Something was watching him, waiting. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for a very, very long time. Michael's breaths were short and ragged as he pressed himself against the damp stone wall of the corridor. The whispers had quieted, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was predatory, a weighty absence of sound that made every beat of his heart feel like a scream. His body was trembling uncontrollably, a cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had to move, he told himself. He couldn't stay there. Yet his feet felt cemented to the ground, as if the very air around him had turned viscous, holding him in place. The box lay where he had dropped it, resting unnaturally still on the pedestal. Its surface seemed to absorb the faint glow of his flashlight, swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. For a moment, Michael considered leaving it behind. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, to abandon whatever mysteries lay within that cursed artifact. But even as his rational mind screamed for escape, something deep within him whispered otherwise. It wasn't curiosity. It was compulsion. It was as if the box was calling him. An invisible tether wrapped around his mind, pulling him closer. As he stared at it, a sensation began to build in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing unease that crept upward, clawing at his chest. The feeling was almost physical, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He tore his gaze away from the box and scanned the shadows that pooled in the corners of the chamber. The beam of his flashlight shook as it swept across the room, but no matter where he pointed it, the darkness seemed impenetrable, alive in its defiance. And then, he felt it. A presence. It wasn't something he could see or hear, but he could feel it, as surely as he could feel the cold stone beneath his feet. It was a suffocating awareness, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him from every direction. Michael's skin crawled as a shiver rippled down his spine. He swung his flashlight frantically, the beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and emptiness. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. He stumbled backward, his shoulder scraping against the jagged wall, and the sharp pain jolted him into action. He had to get out. Now. He turned toward the corridor he had come from, his feet moving almost on their own. But as he stepped forward, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't a breeze. There was no movement of the stale, fetid air, but rather a subtle change in its texture, as if it had grown thicker, more resistant. The whispers returned, soft at first, barely audible beneath the pounding of his heart. But they were different now. They weren't coming from the box. They were coming from the walls. The voices were disjointed, overlapping, their words unintelligible, but dripping with malice. It was as though the very stones around him had been imbued with the memories of unspeakable horrors, and they were desperate to share them. Michael froze, his body rigid with terror, as the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from mocking to menacing. He could feel them crawling into his ears, burrowing into his mind. He pressed his hands to his head, squeezing his eyes shut as if that would block them out. But the voices only grew stronger. Leave. The single word cut through the cacophony, sharp and clear. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Michael's eyes snapped open, his flashlight trembling as he swept it across the chamber. The word had come from the darkness, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to reverberate through the stone. Leave, it said again, the sound vibrating in his chest like the toll of a distant bell. And then he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a darker shape within the oppressive blackness. But as he stared, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, It detached itself from the wall, its form shifting and twisting as it emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could name. Its body was an amalgamation of writhing shadows and jagged edges, its presence more felt than seen. It had no eyes, yet Michael could feel its gaze boring into him, peeling back the layers of his mind and exposing his deepest fears. The flashlight flickered, its weak beam sputtering as if it, too, was terrified. Michael stumbled back, his breath hitching as the shadow creature advanced. It didn't move like a living thing. Its form seemed to ripple and flow, dissolving into the darkness only to re-emerge closer. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his eardrums. "Why have you come?" The voice was a low growl, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. Michael couldn't speak. His throat felt like it had closed, his words strangled by the sheer weight of his terror. He raised the flashlight, the beam trembling as it illuminated the creature's form. But the light didn't reveal details. It only made the thing more incomprehensible. Its edges blurred and warped, its shape constantly shifting, as though it couldn't exist fully in this reality. The box. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The box was the key to whatever this thing was. It had to be. His gaze darted toward the pedestal, the cursed object still sitting unnaturally still. A part of him knew that touching it again would be a mistake, that whatever power it held was beyond his understanding. But another part of him, a darker, more desperate part, screamed that it was his only chance. He took a step toward the box, and the creature reacted immediately. The air around it seemed to distort, a low growl rumbling through the chamber. Michael hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know what would happen if he took the box, but he was certain of one thing. Staying here would mean his death, or worse. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Michael lunged forward, his fingers closing around the cold, unyielding surface of the box. The moment he touched it, the chamber erupted into chaos. The walls shuddered, cracks spiderwebbing across their surface as the ground beneath him shook violently. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than ever, a cacophony of screams and laughter that tore at his sanity. The creature roared, its form expanding and contracting as it lashed out. Michael ducked, the box clutched tightly to his chest, and ran. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The corridor ahead stretched endlessly, the light of his flashlight barely piercing the darkness. But he ran, his heart pounding, the box growing heavier with each step. And behind him, the shadows followed, their hunger palpable, their whispers promising horrors beyond his comprehension. And as he fled, a single chilling thought took root in his mind. He had unlocked something that was never meant to be found. And now, there was no turning back. Michael's legs burned with every stride as he sprinted through the suffocating corridor, the box clutched tightly to his chest. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, echoing off the ancient stone walls like the rasps of a dying man. The air was dense and acrid, filling his lungs with the metallic taste of decay. Behind him, the whispers had returned, not soft and taunting as before, but furious. A cacophony of guttural growls, piercing shrieks, and overlapping voices that spoke a language he couldn't comprehend. The sound was unbearable, crawling into his ears and twisting in his brain like hot needles. The corridor seemed endless, stretching into the dark like a nightmarish tunnel with no escape. The beam of his flashlight wavered as his trembling hands struggled to keep it steady. The walls felt closer now, as though the ancient stones themselves were pressing inward, closing him in. Shadows clung to every surface, moving and shifting unnaturally, their jagged shapes darting just outside the edges of the light. The flickering bulb did little to dispel them. Instead, it seemed to energize them, the faint glow casting grotesque silhouettes that writhed and danced in his peripheral vision. Every footfall was accompanied by an ominous resonance, a vibration in the floor that felt alive. The ground beneath him was no longer solid. It pulsed and quivered, as though the earth itself was reacting to his presence. With every step, the sensation grew stronger until it felt as if the corridor wasn't a corridor at all, but the throat of some vast, slumbering creature he had unknowingly awakened. Behind him, the shadows advanced. They didn't move with the fluidity of living things. They slithered and surged like a tide of living darkness, each tendril a manifestation of something far more ancient and malevolent than Michael could fathom. And within the shadows, shapes emerged, half-formed, grotesque figures that defied logic and reason. Limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces contorted into expressions of unimaginable agony. These were not creatures. They were echoes of the damned, remnants of souls consumed by the very darkness that now pursued him. Michael's mind reeled as he pushed himself forward, his thoughts racing faster than his feet. He couldn't understand what he was seeing, what he had unleashed. The box was heavy in his arms, its surface unnaturally cold, as if it was drawing the heat from his body. He could feel it vibrating faintly, a low, insistent hum that seemed to resonate with the whispers behind him. He wanted to drop it, to cast it away and free himself from its terrible pull, but he couldn't. His hands wouldn't obey. They clung to the box as though it was the only thing tethering him to reality. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single deafening roar that shook the very walls. Michael risked a glance over his shoulder and his heart nearly stopped. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had form, substance. Tendrils of blackness reached out, clawing at the air, their movements erratic and desperate. And in the midst of them, the creature emerged. It was larger now, its form more distinct, yet no less incomprehensible. Its body was a shifting mass of shadow and substance, constantly reshaping itself as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Limbs sprouted and retracted, faces flickered in and out of existence, each one more grotesque than the last. It moved with a predatory grace, its body flowing like liquid, yet striking the ground with an earth-shaking force. And its eyes, if they could be called that, were pits of pure void, so black they seemed to devour the light around them. The sight of it sent a wave of primal terror crashing over Michael. His legs faltered, his balance wavering as he struggled to stay upright. The corridor seemed to tilt beneath him, the walls undulating like the surface of a disturbed pond. He stumbled, the box slipping slightly from his grasp, and the moment it did, the whispers surged forward, louder and more aggressive. The creature roared, a sound so deep and guttural it felt like the earth itself was splitting apart. Michael's survival instincts kicked in, overriding his panic. He tightened his grip on the box and forced his legs to move, propelling himself forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The corridor began to change as he ran. The walls, once uniform stone, became uneven, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. The symbols pulsed in time with the hum of the box, their light growing brighter as Michael passed. The air grew colder, biting at his skin like icy needles. His breath formed clouds in front of him, the mist hanging in the air like ghostly remnants of his desperation. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly, hesitating at the edges of the glowing symbols, but the creature pressed on, its form unaffected by the faint light. Michael's thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind. He didn't know where he was going or if there even was an escape. The corridor felt endless, a labyrinth designed to trap him in a cycle of fear and despair. But then in the distance he saw it, a faint glimmer of light. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the light. The whispers seemed to falter, their intensity waning as the glow grew brighter. But the creature didn't stop. It roared again, the sound reverberating through the corridor and shaking the very ground beneath him. Michael could feel its presence closing in, the air around him growing heavier, colder. The light was closer now, a circular opening at the end of the corridor. It was small, just large enough for him to squeeze through. But it was an escape. Michael didn't think. He acted. He threw himself forward, the box clutched tightly to his chest as he dove toward the opening. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world around him shifted. The whispers ceased, the shadows dissolved, and the oppressive weight lifted. He collapsed onto the cold, hard ground, his body trembling as he gasped for air. The light was blinding, pure, and unrelenting, and for a moment he thought he was safe. But then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping like nails scraping against stone. It was slow, deliberate, and it was coming from behind him. Michael turned, his heart pounding, and saw the corridor he had just escaped. It was still there, its walls glowing faintly with the strange symbols, and in the distance, the shadows began to move once more. The creature was still coming, and Michael realized with chilling certainty that there was no escape. The box had marked him, tethered him to whatever malevolent force he had unleashed. No matter how far he ran, no matter where he hid, it would find him, and when it did, he wouldn't just die, he would cease to exist. Michael's trembling hands clung to the box as he stumbled into the vast chamber, a space that seemed to defy the logic of the fortress's architecture. The air inside was different, thicker, heavier, like a suffocating veil pressing down on his chest. It was alive, vibrating with an otherworldly hum that resonated deep in his bones. The walls were no longer stone, but a pulsating, fleshy mass covered in grotesque patterns of veins and scars. They seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though the room itself was a living organism. The floor beneath him was warm and soft, its surface giving slightly under his weight, as if he were walking on the flesh of some ancient slumbering beast. The chamber was illuminated by a sickly green light emanating from an object at its center. At first, Michael thought it was another artifact, perhaps something connected to the box, but as he approached, he realized it was far more horrifying. A massive, pulsating heart, the size of a man, hung suspended in mid-air, held aloft by tendrils of shadow that coiled around it like living chains. The heart beat slowly and deliberately, each thud sending ripples through the air and causing the ground beneath him to shudder. With each pulse, Michael felt his own heartbeat align with its rhythm, as if the organ was trying to synchronize with his body to claim him as part of itself. The whispers returned, softer now, almost seductive. They spoke directly into his mind, their voices weaving together in a symphony of despair and longing. He couldn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. You are chosen. You are the vessel. You cannot escape. The box in his hands began to vibrate violently, the hum growing louder until it became a deafening roar. Michael's arms felt like they were on fire, the skin beneath his fingertips blistering from the unnatural cold radiating from the artifact. He wanted to let go, to throw it as far away from him as possible, but his body refused to obey. The heart began to change as he drew closer. Faces appeared on its surface, their features twisted in agony and terror. Some were human, others indescribable. Beings that defied logic, their forms a chaotic blend of nightmares and monstrosity. The faces pressed against the translucent membrane of the heart, their mouths opening in silent screams as they clawed at the barrier, separating them from freedom. Michael felt their despair, their pain, as if it were his own. Their suffering was eternal, their torment unending, and they were trapped here because of him. As the realization dawned on him, the whispers became more insistent, their tone shifting from seduction to command. Open it. Open the box. Release us. Michael's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his head spinning. He could feel the weight of countless eyes on him, watching, waiting. The shadows that had pursued him were no longer behind him. They were everywhere, seeping from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They coiled around his limbs, cold and unyielding, pulling him toward the heart. The room began to distort, the walls stretching and twisting as though the chamber itself was being swallowed by the darkness. The pulsating light grew brighter, searing his eyes, but he couldn't look away. The box in his hands began to open on its own, the lid rising slowly despite his desperate attempts to hold it shut. A blinding light spilled out, illuminating the chamber and revealing its true form. The heart was not just an organ, it was a gateway, a bridge between worlds. Through its translucent surface, Michael saw glimpses of another realm, a place of endless void and swirling chaos. Massive, grotesque creatures moved within, their forms incomprehensible, their presence a violation of reality itself. They writhed and clawed at the barrier, their hunger palpable. They were ancient, predating humanity, perhaps predating time itself. And they were waiting, yearning to cross over into Michael's world. The whispers transformed into screams, a deafening chorus of rage and desperation. Michael's mind fractured under the weight of their collective agony. He saw visions of civilizations devoured, of worlds reduced to ash, of endless suffering. These beings had done this before, countless times, and they would do it again. They were unstoppable, insatiable, and he had brought them to the brink of freedom. Suddenly, Michael's surroundings shifted once more. He was no longer in the chamber, but standing in the field outside the fortress. The night was calm, the stars twinkling overhead. For a moment he thought it had all been a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then he looked down and saw the box in his hands, its surface glowing faintly. His relief turned to dread as he realized he hadn't escaped. He had been spared, for now. A voice spoke, clear and cold, not a whisper but a command that reverberated through his entire being. "You are the key. We are coming." The box began to burn in his hands, searing his flesh, but he couldn't let go. He fell to his knees, screaming as the pain overwhelmed him. The ground beneath him cracked, and from the fissures, shadows poured forth, spreading across the field like a living tide. Michael's screams were lost in the roar of the approaching darkness. The fortress crumbled behind him, swallowed by the shadows. But it didn't matter. The box had done its job. The gate was open, and the creatures were free. The last thing Michael saw before the shadows consumed him was the massive pulsating heart, now beating in the sky like a second moon, its surface crawling with the faces of the damned. The world went silent. The stars blinked out, one by one, until only darkness remained. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of terror and despair, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And remember, would you unlock a door if you didn't know what was on the other side? What if it's still waiting for you?